Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Am Yisrael's inaugural One Book, One Congregation event. I'm Barbara Sirota, initiator of and maybe provocateur and rabble-rouser for the program. We'll be discussing People Love Dead Jews, Dara Horn's first work of nonfiction. Thanks to Rabbi Newman Kamen for suggesting this very provocative book. A special warm welcome to our visiting expert, Dr. Claire Soufrin, Associate Professor of Instruction in Jewish Studies and Assistant Director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University. We are a big crowd tonight, surpassing everybody's expectations, and thank you for coming. To get the most out of our limited time, please honor these requests. I'm asking as nicely as I know how. Please make sure you're muted. That's the default position. Remain muted until you're called on, and after you've spoken, please mute yourself again. Keep your remarks brief so everyone has a chance to speak. There are three ways to ask a question. The preferred way, because it's the easiest for you to be seen and noticed, is to raise your hand virtually. You can go to the bottom of your screen, click on reactions, and then click on raise hand. When you've finished speaking, remember to click on lower hand. Second, you can ask a question by just raising your hand physically. I will monitor for that. It's kind of hard sometimes for the speaker to see you, but we'll keep an eye on that. Third, you can type a question in the chat box. I would advise this if you want to be anonymous or if you have laryngitis, because only Nancy and I will see those questions, and we will then read them to Dr. Soufrin and she'll answer. Dr. Soufrin's going to begin with some prepared remarks. While she's speaking, please reserve your questions, or if you can't remember them, just write them in the chat box and we'll address them later. And at this time, I would like to remind everyone to please mute. Northwestern professor Claire Soufrin is a scholar of religion specializing in modern Jewish thought and theology. She's written and taught about German Jewish thinkers, post-Holocaust theology, biblical interpretation, the intersection of religion and literature, and gender and religion. She's the co-editor with Yehuda Kurtzer of the New Jewish Canon 1980 to 2015 Ideas and Debates, which is itself a 2020 National Book Award finalist. She's currently working on a book, Storytelling and Meaning Making, Jewish Literature and Jewish Thought in America. So something to look forward to. Dr. Soufrin holds a BA in Religious Studies from Yale and a PhD in Religious Studies from Stanford. She grew up in Skokie and Glencoe and currently lives with her husband and children in Evanston. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Claire Soufrin. Claire, we're all ears.
Barbara, thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for the invitation. I haven't been physically in Am Yisrael in a long time, but I did go to many bar and bat mitzvahs there, and I see some parents of people I grew up with here in the Chicago area and some former Northwestern students and other friends. And it's wonderful to see you all, whether your name is familiar or not. I am going to share my screen. I am not a very sophisticated user of PowerPoint, but if we were together in person, I would be relying probably on a paper handout or something so that we could all look at the text together. I personally am a very visual learner and need to see the text. and not just hear it if I'm going to get anything out of a lecture. So so I found that PowerPoint is the best way to do that over Zoom. So nothing's going to fly in and out or do anything exciting, but you'll have some text that will help you follow what I'm talking about. So this is my plan. I'm going to give an overview of the book. I'm going to assume that some people have read the whole thing at least once, and that some people perhaps have bought or thought about buying the book or getting it from the library, but haven't yet read it, and that at a minimum, everyone is interested. So because it's not a work of fiction, there aren't really any big spoilers. I'm not worried about giving away the ending per se, but I will speak in a way that is accessible to people who haven't read the book, and hopefully interesting even to those who have. So I'll give a brief overview and just some opening thoughts. And then I want to look at two important themes in the book. I'm calling one of them anti-Semitism, and the other one I'm calling Jewish memory, Jewish stories. And I was a high school newspaper editor, so I'm noticing here that I capitalize memory, but not stories. So let's pretend it's a capital S, and I'll put my inner editor to rest. And then we'll stop for questions, I think, after that. And then I'll end with some closing, sort of summarizing thoughts. So this is Dara Horn, a photograph of her. You'll see it in all of the publicity around the book. It's her standard headshot. And then the book that we're going to talk about today, People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present. If you've heard any interviews with Dara Horn about the book, or even read some of the material that's been published about the book, interviews with her and things like that, she has said a few times already that People Love Dead Jews was her working title for the book, how she thought about it. And she still can't quite believe that her publisher let her go forward with this as the title of the essay collection. And it's purposefully provocative. The tone of the book is a little bit cheeky or snarky. There are moments in which she expresses anger in a very just sort of blunt and straightforward way. She's funny, but always in a sort of sarcastic, I can't believe you said that kind of a tone. I want to make sure you also know that there's a podcast that goes along with the book and presents other stories that might have made their way into the book. She has guests, she interviews them. You can find it just by Googling it or by using, whatever program you like for listening to podcasts. So if you're not familiar with Dara Horn, this book is really a departure from the novel writing that she is best known for. So she published her first novel in the year 2002. She was just a couple of years out of college, and on her way to enrolling in graduate school, she earned a PhD in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. So she has a very deep knowledge and appreciation of that literature. And she did that degree at Harvard, where she worked with Ruth Weiss, who's very familiar as a scholar of Yiddish literature in particular, and as a public intellectual, especially in more sort of politically conservative publications. After publishing in The Image, her first novel, Dara Horn has published 4 others, spanning the last couple of decades. I'm going to talk only briefly about The World to Come. Sorry, my computer gets a little itchy. About The World to Come and about Eternal Life. I'll mention them as we go along, but I would recommend any of them. Her goal, she has described in choosing to become an author rather than to pursue an academic path, her goal has been to create in English a Jewish literature that is as resonant with ancient forms of Jewish literature, with the Bible, with the Talmud, with folk tales, and so on and so forth, as the Yiddish literature and the Hebrew literature that she studied as a graduate student. And she, as I've been preparing this talk, I went back and looked at reviews from the novels as they've come out. And one of the sort of things that a lot of reviewers comment on is how much you get out of her novels when you know all of the sources, while you can still get a lot out of them without knowing all the sources. So they're sort of like multi-layered novels. The essay collection we're talking about today came out in 2021, although many of the pieces were published elsewhere at earlier points. And this is just 4 places where she writes on a semi-regular basis where you may have come across one of her essays before. And then her personal website, I guess as the publisher runs it for her, is just her name.com, and it's a great source for basic information, and you can link to buy all of the books and so on and so forth. So I want to start with theme 1. And to introduce theme 1, which is anti-Semitism, I want to include, or I have here 2 quotations from reviews of People Love Dead Jews. And the first is from my colleague Pam Nadel, who is a historian of American Judaism. And she writes in the Washington Post. She writes, a few years ago, I wrote in, she said this newspaper, but it was in the Washington Post, they're focusing so much on the Holocaust, the museums and memorials dotting our landscape, the innumerable memoirs and novels published every year, the states mandating Holocaust education, that all of that has let Americans off the hook. When we talk about anti-Semitism, we talk about an old world problem, not a new world phenomenon. That's her criticism of what happens with so much focus on the Holocaust. And then turning to the book, Pam Nadel writes, but Horn knows the dark story of Jew hatred on our shores that today has brought murders, attacks in broad daylight on city streets, and vitriol on social media. And indeed, Horn describes the impulse that led her to put together this essay collection. It came from having been the person that the New York Times and other publications turned to in the wake of the Tree of Life attack and the anti-Semitic attack in California that followed shortly thereafter. She had sort of unwittingly, both because of her sort of semi-celebrity as a successful novelist and her excellent style as a writer and her deep engagement with Jewish community, she had become sort of the go-to Jewish intellectual for commentary about anti-Semitism. And so Pam Nadel is right that Horn in this essay collection calls our attention to the reality of anti-Semitism in this country. And she does so because it's an essay collection alongside beautiful essays, beautifully crafted essays about other forms that anti-Semitism takes, and in particular, ways that people talk or present or think about Jews in places where they no longer live. Most of the reviews of the essay collection echo Pam Nadel. I didn't include a quote here, but one of my favorite reviews that I read appeared in the New York Times, and it was written by another novelist. And he describes having a conversation during a trip he made to Belarus, where his family was from, and speaking to a woman there who said to him through a translator that once the Jew, now that there are no Jews, once the Jews were taken away, which would have been during the Holocaust, that the town was dead. And so this reviewer talks about how that experience was recalled to him, that this essay collection recalled that experience. At the bottom half of the slide, though, I've included an example of a negative review, because I think that here, this is my colleague Shaul Magid, who's also a historian, but really much, he's more like me, someone who studies religion, studies a very wide range, but in particular Hasidism and mysticism and similar things. And I think this is a very important and powerful critique and something to keep in mind as we move forward. And he starts by lumping People Love Dead Jews together with other books that have come out lately, like How to Fight Anti-Semitism by Bari Weiss, and other similar books, and calling them a genre of anti-Semitism. And noting that all of these books, Dara Horn's book and the others, have been bestsellers. I looked up, if you look on Amazon, there are several thousand people who have commented on the Amazon page for Dara Horn's book. It is widely bought, widely read. And Magid writes, What one sees from Horn and others is that, in the popular imagination at least, it's as if Salo Baron never existed. His critique of Lachrymose history seems to have simply vanished from the popular scene. One can only imagine how Baron would have responded to People Love Dead Jews, even if he didn't contest one historical claim. Even if the research were impeccable, as it seems to be, the nature of the project isn't merely historically skewed, but its popularity also speaks to a deep inability for much of Jewish culture to think beyond the notion that everyone everywhere eventually hates them. Why? That question is never quite answered, or perhaps better put, it's answered in many unconvincing ways. So Salo Baron, I inserted his dates for you there, was born in Europe and trained as a historian in Europe, and ultimately in, I think, 1930, was hired by Columbia University to teach Jewish history. And that is the first time that a historian was hired by an American university specifically to teach the history of the Jews. And many people point to that appointment as the beginning of Jewish studies in America, because from his appointment grew a Center for Jewish Studies at Columbia and at almost every other major research university in this country. There are some exceptions, but we have one at Northwestern. There's one at the University of Illinois. There's, University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, all of sort of our local, let's put it this way, all of the schools for which you see bumper stickers with some regularity around here, they all have Jewish studies. And Baron is the seed. One of the things that Baron, in addition to the histories that he wrote, one of the things he's most well known for, if not the thing he just simply is the most well known for, is his complaint or his critique that too much Jewish history writing was done in what he called a lachrymose way. The word lachrymose means sort of tearful or sad. And so his critique of the writing of Jewish history before him was that it was always written as a tale of suffering, that the lot of Jews in life throughout time had been to struggle and to suffer. And they suffered from poverty and they suffered from anti-Semitism. And there was very little in this history writing that, for example, would give anybody any explanation of why Jews liked being Jews or wanted to remain Jews. There was very little description of anything that would make life seem worth living. And so he tried to write history that had joy along with suffering, that was balanced in the way that life is balanced between tragedy and celebration. And he inspired, at this point, I think we can say generations of historians of the Jews to move away from an exclusively lachrymose history, even as he certainly would not want anyone to pretend that anti-Semitism didn't exist. You can see from the years that he lived, he was in the US during the Holocaust, but was certainly deeply aware of it. He actually testified at the Eichmann trial and was very much engaged in understanding the Holocaust and its implications for Jewish life. But nevertheless, he felt that historians were inaccurate if they told a story that was only about suffering. So when Shaul Magid criticizes Dara Horn and says that her book is lachrymose, it's a criticism that says this book is entirely about suffering and it doesn't show the richness of Jewish life. I'm going to go ahead and say, and you'll see this as we go through, that I think Magid overstates his case. I don't think that lachrymose is an accurate description of all of the essays put together. Even the fact that it makes you laugh, I think would cause us to question whether it's truly lachrymose. But I wanted to put out there, I wanted to sort of plant in your head this question of whether a focus on anti-Semitism in this book or in other books that we feel compelled to read, what it is that we're missing from our understanding of Jewish history. Oh, okay, so with a book of essays, it's always a little bit challenging to identify what the book as a whole is arguing, right? I read a lot of books that have one argument and then go chapter through the different evidence for that argument. But a collection of essays like this one is loosely, the essays are all loosely connected. There's a thematic unity, but there's not a single argument. I can't say that Dara Horn is arguing X. And in part, that's what Magid is pointing to when he says, you know, he complains that she doesn't explain why Jews are certain that everyone who isn't Jewish is an anti-Semite, or even why all of those people are anti-Semites. Instead, we get sort of pictures, glimpses of different places that she travels to and different moments in her life. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk about themes and try to draw kind of her point out of them by looking at different essays from the book that deal with these two themes. So this quotation that you have up here on the slide is from an essay about the Soviet Union, and in particular, the way that the Soviet Union gained the support of many Jewish artists, and then ultimately came to persecute and execute them, most of them in the end. And in this passage, Horn is describing a conversation that she has with the daughter of one of the artists who she has already spoken about. And she relays, the daughter's name is Allah, or Allah. So in Jerusalem that morning, Allah told me in a sudden private moment of anger and candor that the Soviet Union's treatment of Jews was worse than Nazi Germany's. I tried to argue, but she shut me up. Obviously, the Nazi atrocities against Jews were incomparable, a fact Allah later acknowledged in a calmer mood. But over 4 generations, the Soviet regime forced Jews to participate in and internalize their own humiliation. And in that way, Allah suggested they destroyed far more souls, and they never, ever paid for it. They never had a Nuremberg or any sort of public reckoning. Allah told me that day with a quiet fury. They never acknowledged the evil of what they did. The Nazis were open about what they were doing, but the Soviets pretended. They lured Jews in. They baited them with support and recognition. They used them, they tricked them, and then they killed them. It was a trap, and no one knows about it, even now. People know about the Holocaust, but not this. Even here in Israel, people don't know. And then she asks Horn, how did you know? And Horn, of course, knows through the literature. It's the literature that led her to the history. The argument or the idea that gives the book its title, Horn is fascinated by public commemorations of Jews and Jewish life in places where Jews no longer live. And she has a couple of case studies that I'm not going to look at, or we're not going to look at passages from, but she argues that there is a pattern where historically Jews thrived in these places. Harbin, China is one. The Soviet Union is one. Jews thrived as a minority within a larger community for some time, and then eventually, because of persecution to varying degrees or changing conditions that we really could describe as persecution, were forced to leave or were even killed. And today, whether it's several centuries later or a few decades later, many of these places have museums of Jewish life that she notices in her travels. Never, they celebrate what once was, but they never explain why there are no Jews in that place anymore. And so her contention is that non-Jews in the world are very comfortable talking about Jews who no longer exist, or the former presence of Jews who are now absent, what she calls dead Jews. But they are so uncomfortable with living Jews that there's no space for them even. She describes in Harbin, China, the way that the former synagogue has been remade as a place to hear an orchestra perform, even as it is completely recognizably a synagogue and would be recognized as a synagogue. She recognizes it. Any Jew would recognize it as a synagogue. But because there are no Jews, It's not even necessary. The people living now in Harbin, China, they don't even feel it's necessary to change the look of the place so that it no longer looks like a synagogue. In contrast to the dead Jews of places like the Soviet Union, I should say she doesn't travel to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union no longer exists. She doesn't. There's no Soviet museum that we have today celebrating Soviet Jewish artists. It's not a perfect comparison, but I will share with you this, for me, was a moment that echoed with my own experience many years ago. I was trying to remember what year. I think it was 2005. I traveled to Spain with a friend, and in one of the towns we were in, there was a Jewish museum, and we visited it. And I have to tell you, it's now 15 or 16, 17 now years later. I don't remember anything about the museum, except for the fact that we both noticed that there was no discussion of the expulsion of Jews from Spain. It perfectly fit the pattern that Horn identifies. She does not use the expression American exceptionalism, but American exceptionalism is a phrase that shaped the understanding of, or historians' understanding of Jewish life in America for many, many decades, namely the idea that in America, things were different, that America was an exception to all of the other places that Jews have lived historically, where they lived under threat, sometimes a lot of threat, sometimes a little threat, but not fully comfortably, not as full members of the society. And that America was different. And in America, Jews were fully accepted, and all public offices were open to them, and they could be Jews in public, and they were safe. They didn't feel persecuted. Their synagogues weren't attacked, and so on and so forth. And even before the Tree of Life attack and recent events of anti-Semitism, historians have been, my colleagues have been returning to this idea and asking whether it's really the best way to describe Jewish life in America. Is it really an exception? Has it been an exception for part of the time? Or perhaps thinking of it as an exception has led historians to write histories that are overly non-lachrymose, that are only about the celebrations and the joy and the happiness and the accomplishments, and that minimize anti-Semitism that has existed and that has shaped people's lives. It could be social anti-Semitism, it could have been anti-Semitism in the culture and public culture, and there are examples we could point to. And how do we weigh the two? What's the best way to balance the lachrymose and the non-lachrymose as we think about American Jewish history? This is a passage from Horn's book. You can see it's toward the very end, where she's writing about her understanding of American anti-Semitism. She writes of all the tedious and self-serving explanations for why this scourge was apparently reemerging in American life. Guns, Trump, trolls, Twitter. The most convincing was actually the most boring and also the most disturbing. The last few generations of American non-Jews had been chagrined by the enormity of the Holocaust, which had been perpetrated by America's enemy, and which was grotesque enough to make anti-Semitism socially unacceptable, even shameful. Now that people who remembered the shock of those events were dying off, the public shame associated with expressing anti-Semitism was dying too. In other words, hating Jews was normal. And historically speaking, the decades in which my parents and I had grown up, simply hadn't been normal. Now, normal was coming back. So this is an example of an argument against American exceptionalism, that the American Jewish experience is not an exception, but has anti-Semitism in it that shapes Jewish life, or it makes fear a central theme of Jewish life, just as it did in other places. And this is, the idea that non-Jews hate Jews is an idea that runs through the book, whether it's in the preference, and I should say, the one nuance that is definitely there is this tension between dead Jews and living Jews. So we could say that that she is claiming that the way that most non-Jews think about Jews is in negative ways. They're happy to think of them as a relic of the past, who perhaps made a contribution to a certain place, but the presence of a thriving Jewish life, non-Jews don't know what to do with it. This is a very different piece in the book, and I think that it introduces a little bit of ambivalence about the thesis. So she is reflecting on an exhibit called Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. It is a traveling exhibit about the death camp that goes into extraordinary detail about the way that the camp was built and planned and operated. And she notes that this is an exhibit put together not by a Holocaust Memorial Museum to share with other Holocaust Memorial Museums. It is put together by a for-profit company that only puts together exhibits that it knows are going to sell a lot of tickets. That's sort of the way to put it most straightforwardly. You may remember them. They did a major exhibit on the human body using cadavers that caused a big splash not so long ago and raised all kinds of ethical questions. And Horn reflects on it, having gone to the exhibit. She says, "What I'm wondering about is the purpose of my knowing all of these obscene facts in such granular detail. I already know the official answer, of course. Everyone must learn the depths to which humanity can sink. Those who do not study history are bound to repeat it. I attended public middle school. I have been taught these things. But as I read the endless wall texts describing the specific quantities of poison used to murder 90% of Europe's Jewish children, something else occurred to me. Perhaps presenting all these facts has the opposite effect from what we think. Perhaps we are giving people ideas. I don't mean giving people ideas about how to murder Jews. There is no shortage of ideas like that, going back to Pharaoh's decree in the book of Exodus about drowning Hebrew baby boys in the Nile. I mean rather that perhaps we are giving people ideas about our standards. Yes, everyone must learn about the Holocaust so as not to repeat it. But this has come to mean that anything short of the Holocaust is, well, not the Holocaust. The bar is rather high. The implication being, of course, that so much focus on the Holocaust in American life, in Jewish American life, in the world, leads us to minimize other examples of the Holocaust, right? The Tree of Life, we could understand it as something very isolated. The more recent, taking of hostages in Texas, the work of a crazy person, somebody deeply mentally ill. And both of them in every other case, well, not the Holocaust. And so this is a plea, I think, in all of these essays to take a bigger view and to pay attention, and on some level, I think also to be a little bit more willing to be afraid, to give in to the fear and then act from it, even when it's not quite the Holocaust. This is, I think, my last note on the anti-Semitism theme, and I'd be happy to return to this during the Q&A if people want to. I'm not going to spend a long time on it now. I have an eye on the time and other things to talk about, but I found it intriguing, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts or to talk more about it. So she argues that there are two patterns of anti-Semitism, and that these patterns, the paradigm, they each have a paradigm in the Bible and a paradigm among Jewish holidays. I should say Hanukkah is not actually in the Bible. So we should say more simply, they each have a paradigm captured by the story of a different Jewish holiday. So Purim and Hanukkah, which both celebrate the triumph of a Jewish community over forces that sought to destroy it. So if you look here, this is the third line up here on the top paragraph. In the Purim version of anti-Semitism, exemplified by the Persian genocidal decrees in the biblical book of Esther, the goal is openly stated and unambiguous: kill all the Jews. In the Hanukkah version of anti-Semitism, whose appearances range from the Spanish Inquisition to the Soviet regime, the goal is still to eliminate Jewish civilization. And I want you to notice, kill the Jews, eliminate not Jews, but Jewish civilization. As she puts it, we could say Jewish culture. In the Hanukkah version, going back to her paragraph, this goal could theoretically be accomplished by destroying Jewish civilization while leaving the warm, de-Jewed bodies of its former practitioners intact. When I was growing up, I was born in 1978. I graduated from college in 2000. So when I especially was in middle school and high school and college in the 90s, this sort of argument would have been very familiar. It's an argument about assimilation, about societies that demand that Jews change their ways to such a degree that they fit into the larger society, but they risk losing their Jewish distinctiveness. As she puts it, and you'll see here a sense of sort of the snark that makes its way, that is woven through the book. She says, for this reason, the Hanukkah version of anti-Semitism often employs Jews as its agents. It requires not dead Jews, but cool Jews, those willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is currently uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, going back to its origins as the planet's only monotheism, featuring a bossy and unsexy invisible God. Uncoolness is pretty much Judaism's brand, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah anti-Semitism's success. So here, of course, cool is a shorthand for the majority culture, and uncoolness for the, not just for being a minority, but for being a minority with distinctive characteristics, distinctive ways of life. So hold on to all of that. I want to pivot a little bit, because while almost all of the reviewers identify anti-Semitism as the focus of the book, and the title certainly fits with that focus, I think there is at least one other very, very interesting thing going on in the book, and that's what I'd like to call your attention to now. And I should say as well, that this is not exclusive. These are not the only two themes, and this is just my take on it. So I'm calling it Jewish Memory, Jewish Stories. Horn opens the book by describing herself as a child being overwhelmed by the fact that every present moment slips immediately into the past, that the present is continually becoming the past. As soon as you become aware of being in the present, that present moment in which you had the realization is gone. And she describes herself, and maybe some of you were like this as kids, or have raised children like this, or babysat for them. I have, of my two kids, one of them has a problem kind of like this, of laying awake late at night trying to solve problems like this. And Horn describes that she found not a solution, but a new way of thinking about it in her studies of Judaism. So she writes, there was an alternative to being trapped in the present, a deep consciousness of memory that transcended any one person or lifetime. I dove into this possibility, body and soul. My studies of Hebrew, the language itself had layers, from airheaded TV shows all the way down to biblical bedrock, led to studies of Yiddish, which led to a doctorate in both, which flowed into my fiction. I wrote my way down into that tunnel through time, burrowing deeper into a past that was in fact the present, a breathing reality just beneath the surface of the current moment, until I was no longer afraid to fall asleep. This, to me, was what being Jewish meant, the gift it gave me in the wonderland of a country that long ago gave my family a future. And then this is indeed from the introduction to the book. So she shifts as I slowly came to understand this is not what it meant to people who weren't Jewish, or even to many Jews with little education in the culture. We've talked already about that last part, but I want to, I chose this passage because this is her definition of Jewishness, of an uncool Jewishness that resists losing itself into a majority community or a majority culture. It is a language and a way of being that has layers all the way down to the biblical bedrock. And I want you to notice, by thinking about language, it is a way of telling stories. Judaism is a way of telling stories. And she herself has chosen to be a storyteller. And there are several essays in the book that talk about Jewish stories, and in particular about myths that Jews tell in order to explain not only who they are, but also why they are living where they are in the way that they are. And she points to different communities that we know, historic communities that we know had myths about how it is that they came to settle there. Right? Because in any place where Jews live, at some point, whether it's the current generation or several generations ago, they came from somewhere else. So many communities, if not all Jewish communities, have stories and myths that they tell about how they got there. She says there's a clear pattern to these legends, which are all about living in places where you are utterly vulnerable and cannot admit it. These stories express the Jewish community's two highest hopes and deepest fears. The first hope is that the Jews in this new place will remain part of the chain of Jewish tradition. And the second hope is that the local population will accept them. The fears, of course, are the inverse of being cut off from that chain going back to Mount Sinai and of being subject to whims of the non-Jewish majority. These couldn't be more real because being a diaspora community means being vulnerable. It is a high wire act of the highest order. There are political strategies for dealing with that vulnerability, but these founding legends are an emotional strategy and their power is unmatched. So there's the, very cool pattern we can notice about all of these communities through time and across space having legends about how they got there. But here we see also the appreciation she has for the ways that people still tell stories that aren't necessarily and probably aren't historically accurate, but are emotionally powerful. And as a storyteller, of course, that is something she would care very much about. The American myth that she focuses on is very much the myth of the arrival of Eastern European Jews in this country. There was a major wave, as you likely know, of Eastern European Jews between 1880 and 1920, basically starting with some major pogroms, especially in the Russian Empire, and ending with legislation in this country that basically closed the doors to immigrants, and they've never been opened as widely as they were before that since then. So we should note that this tradition or this legend, this myth of people having their names changed at Ellis Island, upon immigration, is a myth that applies to a big chunk of American Jews. It is, a story that describes, or that echoes, let's put it that way, echoes with the experiences of their forebears, but it's not. It doesn't echo with the family stories of every American Jew. So many families believe that their last names, their surnames, family names, were changed at Ellis Island from something with a lot of consonants and a lot of syllables that doesn't really work very well into English, into something short, snappy, easy to say, easy to spell. But the fact of the matter is, when you go and you look at historical records, that didn't really happen. And in fact, most Jews who live today with a name different from the name of their Eastern European forebears, somebody in their family at some point changed it formally and legally. So let's take a look at how she describes it. And I should say as well, this is something she has talked about in some of her public speaking, and she finds that people don't like to be told this. Jews don't like to be told that this myth is not accurate history. She writes, "You can tell your children that something funny happened at Ellis Island, something completely innocent that didn't hurt you, but only helped you. If you tell that story, you've accomplished two things. First, you've made America into a place where people maintain their Jewish identity without any interruption of the line from Sinai. And second, you've made America into a place so welcoming that happy non-Jews greet you at the door and then make innocent mistakes that coincidentally help you to fit right in at no cost to you or to the 3,000-year-old tradition you want to maintain. This is the legend that the ancestors of today's American Jews created for their descendants. We were told that our ancestors were definitely not humiliated people facing the reality of American anti-Semitism, even though that is demonstrated by thousands of court records." And I want to say, just as an aside, she's not talking about court records of anti-Semitism, but court records of name changes, where people explain that they are changing their name because they can't get a job, or the Jewishness of their name is preventing them from living the life they want to live fully. Horn continues, she said, "No, our ancestors were brave, were brave and hopeful people whom America joyously welcomed through that golden door. The lethal attacks on American Jews in recent years have been so shocking and disorienting, not merely because of their sheer violent horror, but because they contradict the story American Jews have told themselves for generations, which is that America has never been a place where anti-Semitism affected anyone's life. We don't simply prefer this founding legend. We need it. The story is more important than the history because the story is the device that makes meaning." And I made it bold. That's my probably favorite sentence in the whole book. And there's a real tension. You can see it in looking at this passage and thinking about the passages we looked at earlier, right? She said, anti-Semitism is the normal. And here she's saying, we tell ourselves myths and legends and we hold on to them because we need them, even though they also allow us to deny, this is me speaking now, these myths and legends also allow us to deny the anti-Semitism of the American past. And as a result, anti-Semitism today seems all the more surprising and incomprehensible. This is a different case study. In one of the essays, Horn talks about a letter she receives from one of her readers complaining that one of her novels is not redemptive enough. That this reader likes to read books that make her feel good about herself because they show, people helping other people. And in Horn's novel, I don't remember which one it was that the reader was complaining about, but people simply suffered. And there was no character who came in to rescue them and save the day, no sort of redemptive moment that would make this reader feel better about herself. Horn writes, "I eventually came to understand the profound insult inherent in the messages I was receiving, both directly and indirectly, from readers expecting uplifting Jewish literature full of moments of grace. So an insult not to me as a novelist, but to my ancestors who endured experiences like those I gave to my characters, and in a sense to all those who have endured the most atrocious moments of Jewish history. Readers who demanded that, quote, coherence from literature about the modern Jewish experience were essentially insisting that Jewish suffering was only worth examining if it provided, in the words of my reader's memorable message, a service to mankind. In retrospect, I am stunned by how long it took me to understand just how hateful this was. Consider, as I only very slowly did, what this demand really entails. Dead Jews are supposed to teach us about the beauty of the world and the wonders of redemption. Otherwise, what was the point of killing them in the first place? That's what dead Jews are for. If people were going to read about dead Jews, meaning her characters, what was the service to humankind I owed them?" She presents as a contrast, she presents as a contrast a novel by a Yiddish writer named Chava Rosenfarb, who it's a 3-book series of presenting artists and a number of very beautiful scenes where the artists gather and they create beautiful things. But the 3rd book in the trilogy ends at the gates of Auschwitz. So she presents it as an example of the tendency in Yiddish literature in particular, not to have redemptive endings where everything comes to a nice close, tie the bow, everything is neat, but rather they just end. They end because the main character dies, or they end and things just, you assume, continue as they've gone, with the good and the bad and everything in between. I'm not an expert in Yiddish literature, but my understanding is that she's right, that the overwhelming tendency in Yiddish literature is not to have an upbeat, neat ending, but to have an ending that is in the same tone as the rest of the book, which is, if the book is about suffering, it ends with suffering. If the book is about struggles, it ends with struggles. That doesn't mean there's not room for beauty and joy, but it's not, you don't leave the book feeling hopeful about the world and all of the good people in it. You leave in the same world that the book takes place in, where there's a lot of suffering and it's hard. And it has historically been always hard to be a Jew. So this is where I was as I thought about what to say tonight. I gathered these passages and put them together, identified these 2 themes that I think to some degree are intention in the book, but in some degree work together. And there was something that was really very much bothering me, which is, actually we'll start here with Salo Baron, which is that Judaism, the religion, has an element of redemption to it. There is a very Jewish notion of redemption. And even if the Yiddish writers that Horn so deeply loves and has studied didn't write redemptive fiction, I think it's important to remember that a belief in something better, and in particular, the language we use is a messianic age, that's a defining characteristic of Judaism. It's part of our prayers, it's part of our beliefs. We find it, way down in the bedrock of the Hebrew Bible, going through all of the layers. It's been a major source of comfort for Jews in very, very hard times. And if we look, Salo Baron, the one who pushed back against the lachrymose view of Jewish history, in an interview in 1975, this is one of the single statements that you see quoted most often. He said, "Suffering is part of the destiny of the Jews, but so is repeated joy as well as ultimate redemption." So he identifies sort of 3 defining characteristics of what it is to be a Jew. So we know, of course, that he's going to have joy. He acknowledges the reality of suffering. And then he points to ultimate redemption, belief in that messianic era as a final, or as a 3rd defining characteristic that sustains Jewish life and gives it shape and meaning. So why doesn't Horn consider that? And I don't have an answer, but one possibility is, of course, it's her immersion in Yiddish literature in particular. But there is also another possibility, which is that messianism, or belief in messianism, has become too weak in Jewish life, too without shape, too undefined. This is a text, actually not a contemporary text, but a text from 1934, from Judaism as a Civilization, which is the main, or the most well-known and longest book written by Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who was ultimately the founder of the Reconstructionist movement. And Kaplan argued that in modern times, as things had become easier for Jews, as they had been emancipated in Europe and as they came to the United States, where they were able from day one to be full citizens and practice their religion freely, that they no longer needed a belief in an afterlife, in a world to come that would sustain them, or they no longer needed that to sustain them, and they became much more focused on this life and this world and all of the forms of fulfillment that they could find in the here and now. For Kaplan, he wants to remake Judaism in response to that shift. So what you have up here on the screen is a description of the pre-modern Jew, and the pre-modern Jew remaining attached to the Jewish people for the sake of what he calls here the next world, or the world to come, and that it was personal and individual and it was collective. And all of this ultimately for him is to say that the Jews are no longer have the unity that they once had, because they no longer really care about the idea of a world to come. They no longer care about a possibility of redemption that is somewhere in the infinite future, and that will reverse or replace all of the difficulties of life in the here and now. Horn actually has a novel called The World to Come. It's her second novel. She described it, I appreciated this, as the novel she worked on when she didn't want to work on her dissertation, and then she worked on her dissertation when she didn't want to work on her novel, and then she felt like she was always working on something she wanted to do. And she makes a very interesting choice in this novel, which is she builds this novel on a legend that many of you may be familiar with. And the legend is that it's a Jewish legend that before they're born, the souls of babies reside in the world to come with everybody who has already died. And there they study Torah with angels and with their ancestors. And they learn everything. And then right before they're born, an angel touches them right under their nose, on their sort of upper lip, and they forget it all and they come into the world, right, ignorant, knowing nothing. And it's the legend explains why, everyone has kind of a little dip in their lip there, some more pronounced than others. And it also, I think, goes a long way toward explaining why we sometimes learn something and we feel as though it makes so much sense. It's as though we already knew it, just nobody had put it into words before. And in this novel, one of the characters at the center is struggling to come to terms with the death of his parents and with the history of his family. There's a lot of other things going on. It's also about Chagall and about a Yiddish writer, a real Yiddish writer. But this main character's mother shared with him the legend. And she says to him, I believe that when people die, they go to the same place as all the people who haven't yet been born. That's why it's called the world to come, because that's where they make the new souls for the future. And the reward when good people die is that they get to help make the people in their families who haven't been born yet. And yet, at the end of the book, that character, the son, this describes what happens to him. When he finally fell asleep, his dreams contain no stories at all, but only the hard stones of thoughts, the unimaginably unlikely coincidence of being alive at the same time as the love of your life, the frequency with which a person was expected to bear the body and the burden of someone else, the idiocy of thinking that kindness can protect the person who is kind, and worst of all, the bottomless pit of a truth that he had suddenly, sickeningly seen, that the world to come that his parents had always talked about was not an afterlife at all, but simply this world to come, the future world, your own future, that you are creating for yourself with every choice you made in it. Horn's character embodies ultimately, or comes to the conclusion that Kaplan outlined in the 1930s, that modern Jews can't believe, or find themselves unable to believe in the possibility of a world to come. And that's where Horn leaves him. And I think, even though that novel and the essay collection are divided in her career by more than 15 years, I think that she herself is maybe a little bit too far from the promise of redemption that is woven into the Jewish tradition, and that for so many centuries gave Jews an answer to the question, for what may we hope? Right? That's one of the things religion does, is it answers the question, for what may we hope? And I don't know if it's possible to have a rich messianism. I think in many ways, and this is beyond her book, and if people are interested, we can return during the questions. I think in many ways the state of Israel complicates our thinking about messianism, because at different moments in its existence, it's been treated as being of almost messianic proportions. But this is what allowed me to articulate for myself what's missing from her book, or what I wanted to see, which was some kind of a hope, some kind of a promise of something better, even if that hope is in an unreachable, unknowable future, even if it's unsatisfying, just to recognize that as another way of connecting to the Jewish past. She begins the essay collection talking about her deep fear that she had as a child of the present slipping into the past. That passage from the novel that I just showed you is this sense of the present slipping into the future. But what do things look like from God's perspective? What does time look like from God's perspective? Might be another way of approaching these fears, and beginning to sort of think about what Judaism, the religion, might contribute to this set of ideas that she presents primarily out of Yiddish literature. So I will stop. I'm happy to hear questions. Please raise your electronic hands. As Barbara described, you can use the reactions menu down at the bottom. And I see one already, and I will do my best to pronounce everyone's name correctly. If I mispronounce your name, just correct me. Rosette.
I'm a little confused by some of what you're saying, because it doesn't go along with her very last chapter. I thought her very last chapter comes around to the feeling that you're just saying, because she leaves it and she's going off to study Torah and connecting to the past and to the present. And I found the end of the book to be uplifting.
Yeah, thank you, Rosette. So I agree. So the book end, or the very last essay in the book, the last sort of 3 or 4 pages, Horn describes how she decides to participate in Daf Yomi, which is reading a page of the Talmud every day. It takes about 7 years, and there's a schedule. So everybody who's participating reads the same page every day, and then they all complete the Talmud at the end of the 7 years and X number of months, and there are big celebrations, and then the whole cycle starts over again. And so it does end, I agree, on an uplifting note where she feels very connected to the Jewish past. So I'm being a little bit more fussy, to be a little bit more explicit. I agree that she's connected to the Jewish past. I think it comes through there in very positive terms. It comes through when she talks about the Hebrew language and the bedrock of the Bible. I'm talking about a very specific idea, which is the rabbinic idea and the biblical idea before that, of a Messiah, of a return to the world as God wanted it to be, to a time of justice. And that's not part of what she discusses at the end of the book. She discusses what the Talmud has to say about life in the everyday. She actually refers to the very opening of it, which the opening question is, when can you say the evening Shema? That's how it begins. And so that's where she starts, and she talks about how familiar it is because she says the Shema. And it's this very lovely, very, very sweet kind of reflection on the joy of studying Talmud. But I don't think that anywhere in the book that she engages with all of the ideas that Jews have historically, the hopes that they have placed in the Messiah. So I'm separating connection to the Jewish past through Talmud from this one very specific idea. So you can also think that I'm wrong. I may well be, but that's where I am at the moment. I see Bobby and Phil.
Yeah, this is Bobby. So I was struck by that last chapter too, um, and um, and I guess I found something uplifting in not having to have a messianic ending to things. What inspired me was that she was joining this process of multiple views.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's this way, but then Rabbi so and so says no, but it could be that way, and another rabbi says, no, I think it's something else altogether. And it keeps you alive and it keeps you in contact with what's going on and what's important to you. And you don't have to have certainty and finality. So I don't know if that was her message or not, but I find that a positive and maybe the only way you can deal with life without going nuts.
So I will tell you that the first time I read the book, I was very angry with her for ending with that note about the Talmud, because it is very positive and uplifting. And I had this feeling of, why are you ending your book on this uplifting note when you've just told us that Jewish stories are not supposed to end on an uplifting note? And I forgave her. She's allowed, and it is a book of essays, and most of the essays don't end on these uplifting notes. And I should say as well, so we're on the quarter system here at Northwestern, 10 weeks, and then we're done, and we do it 3 times between September and June. So this is, today was supposed to be the last day of class for my current students, but I'm making them come one more time. They're not very happy about it. But the course I've been teaching is called God After the Holocaust, and it's about post-Holocaust theology. And basically how mostly rabbis, but sort of rabbi philosophers tried to articulate where God was during the Holocaust, or how we can believe in a God who didn't stop the Holocaust, how the Holocaust should change or does change, what Judaism means. And we always start the course. I only teach it every other year because it's heavy. But I've taught it quite a few times at this point. And we always I bring them examples, both from the Bible and from the rabbis, of Jewish ways of dealing with tragedy, right? So we read the book of Job. We look at Psalm 8, which expresses, anger at God for not, basically says, we've always done what you wanted, and you used to help us in battle, and now you're not helping us, and we're still doing what you want. And when are you going to come back and save us from our enemies? Much more, it says it much more poetically than that. And then we look at some really incredible midrashim where the rabbis wrestle with the destruction of the temple, and they express tremendous anger at God. And in the passage that I love most, they bring Abraham out of his grave to heaven. And Abraham says, basically, how could you do this? And God says, the people were terrible and they deserved this. And Abraham says, basically, oh yeah? Who's going to testify? Right? And there's this court scene where God says, well, the Torah will testify, and this personified Torah comes. And then Abraham engages, we have any lawyers in the room, in like badgering of the witness, and basically says, the Israelites were the only people who accepted you, and now you're going to testify against them. And the Torah steps back. And then each letter of the alphabet comes forward to testify against the Jews. And Abraham convinces them not to. And it goes on from there, page after page. And at the very end, God says, all right, at some point in the future, I'll forgive the people and I'll bring them back to the land of Israel. And so that's been on my mind, right? That this is part of the rabbinic tradition. We have rabbinic traditions of responding to suffering, of engaging in questions of how do we believe and what can we believe in? And that to know that Horn is studying Talmud and finds it so meaningful and finds it in some ways sort of a solution or a response to anti-Semitism, but doesn't engage with those stories. And I don't know whether she knows them or not, but it frustrated me. I will be honest. And that is part of what I think I'm what I'm reacting to in my presentation. So I agree that Jews should engage in studying Jewish sources. Some of the philosophers who I study, Martin Buber, for example, and his colleague Franz Rosenzweig, when the Nazis came to power, they responded by creating centers for Jews to study Judaism. And they traveled around Germany, giving talks about Jewish sources, about Torah and Talmud and Jewish philosophy. And they did it until, they were became illegal to do that. And they were expressly, Rosenzweig actually died before the Nazis came to power, but Buber sort of brought his institute back to life and did this and traveled until he himself was expressly forbidden by the Nazis to do so. So her turn to studying is deeply familiar and I think very powerful. But I think there are even more resources than she even gives us a sense of. And I would have liked to see her engage with some of those Jewish stories as well. Martha.
This is sort of a statement on the roots of her research being non-theological for most, or certainly for starting out. And the reason I mention it is, when you start to look at something, you see them all over replicating. And so there's recently been a book out about the Kaduris and the Sesongs and how they built up Shanghai and built up Hong Kong, and then what happened to them and World War II. And there was just one which was in the Wall Street Journal today or earlier in the week, last week, and I can't remember the author's name, and it is based on Moiseville, Moses Villa, and the 5,000 member community that existed outside of Buenos Aires. Mm-hmm. How long? So this theme of all, she really hit right on it with the Harbin and with all the others. So without even a philosophical bent to it, just the circumstances, the social part.
Yeah. She's absolutely right, or you're absolutely right. And I think Horn is right in her criticism, both of, places that are eager to celebrate a past Jewish life, but not, acknowledge how it came to an end. And I could not agree with her more about her her critique of the Holocaust exhibit in the museum. But I also wonder what we lose when we pay so much attention to the way that non-Jews think about us versus attention to ourselves, how we want to understand ourselves, what it is to be Jewish, what keeps us Jewish, and so on and so forth. And the criticism of Magid from the very beginning that Dara Horn doesn't provide a thick answer of why Jews remain Jewish. We have the passages about the Talmud at the end, but other than that, there's not much in here. to explain it other than perhaps anti-Semitism. And I found myself wanting more of that. It's not a negative versus positive, but more of a, what do we want to construct? What do we, what are the values we want to embrace and act them out, despite all of these challenges, despite the fact that it could be that at some point there might not be Jewish life in America, that there will be Jewish life somewhere else. And I think it's worth noting the book is very specifically not about Israel. She didn't want to write a book about Israel. She's acknowledged this in interviews. And I think we also should ask ourselves, how does the existence of the state of Israel today change some of the calculus in the book? How does it affect what it means to be in diaspora? How does it affect what it means to be a Jew in a Jewish majority space? And it's not there, and it's not fair, right, to criticize someone for not writing the book that you wanted to read. That's not, she makes clear it's not fair, and she's right. But it's a partial picture, I guess, at the end of the day. And I think it's important to remember that, to read it, to acknowledge, to understand it, to talk about it, and then to think about, what other books do we want to read to sort of fill out the picture, or to understand ourselves better. So I know it's getting late, and I see we're losing a couple of people as the minutes tick by. Barbara, should we conclude?
I would like to ask whether there is an interest in continuing this discussion on our own. Rabbi Newman Kamen has volunteered to lead a discussion if we want to have another one. So do you think that I could have a show of hands for people who might be interested in planning something like that?
Looks pretty unanimous.
Looks pretty unanimous to me.
It's
Thank
probably
you.
not fair because I'm sitting here. You should have taken a secret vote.
Oh, I see. We should have done it in an executive session. Okay, that sounds good. Claire Soufrian, we are just delighted that you came and spoke with us. I found this to be fascinating, and I think everyone else did too. And I hope you'll join us again one of these days. I also want to thank everyone for participating, for reading the book, for listening, and for sharing your ideas.
Thank you so much for having me. I see there's some hands that have gone up in the last few minutes, but I think we'll call it a night. And I would just say, in closing, that Dara Horn's most recent novel is by far my favorite, and I've taught it in adult education settings quite a few times at this point. And it's about a Jewish woman who can't die. She lives at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, and she takes a vow at the temple before the destruction. And so she lives through all of Jewish history. And it's really quite something. And I kept thinking about that as well as I read this book. And the character ultimately struggles to be in the present because she has just lived the story over and over and over again. And so I want to close by bringing us back to that moment of finding meaning in the present by knowing that everything that we do now, our Jewish lives, become part of a rich and meaningful Jewish history, and that our stories that we tell, our legends, our myths, everything that we share with our children and our grandchildren and so on and so forth, will give meaning to a future as well. And that articulation of Jewishness is just so powerful for me. And I think at the end of the day, we can think of it as the Jewish way of loving Jews, as opposed to the non-Jewish way of loving Jews. And as Jews, we love Jews who are dead, and we love Jews who are alive, and we love Jews who will be alive in the future. And that's part of who we are. So I will end there. Thank you again. And I hope your next discussion of the book go well. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.